All right, welcome and thank you for tuning in. I'm Jessica Knutson. I'm the Secondary Transition Coordinator for Northern Lights Special Ed Cooperative. This is our 12th and last Tuesday Transition Talks at 12 parent webinar series. And this series was brought together by the interagency effort between Northern Lights Interagency Council and the Interagency Coordinating Council of Duluth for parents within the 14 districts we serve. In preparing your child for life after high school, today's topic is about working with community providers. And this will be presented by Josh Howie from Trillium Works, Inc. and Charles Gornick from TLC of Duluth. And without further ado, I will turn it over. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jess. So we'll just get started here with what we have to talk about. What Josh and I find a lot of the time when we're working with the individuals we serve or their families is we get a lot of questions, and some of them are pretty recurring questions about what it's like to work with providers, how to get started with the process, that type of a thing. So what we were kind of envisioning, we know that people who have attended this entire series will have had some interaction with the voc rehab folks, with the county workers potentially. So there's going to be a little bit of an overlap to what we're talking about, but really what we're hoping is in answering some of the questions we see frequently with people starting up services, we can kind of bridge all of those together into one bigger picture for how providers like Trillium, TLC, or any of the others in the area fit in with some of those services. So what you'll see on the screen here right now, this is kind of a list of some of the big 5 questions that we get asked pretty frequently. And we're going to use this as kind of the outline for what we're going to go through and talk about. So looking at questions that we often get presented, like when should services start, what's available, what's the funding for those services, how do we start services, and what should we know about you or working with other providers. So we're going to work through our series of questions here, answering them as best as we can. And what we'll kind of do is Josh will speak more to transitional stuff related to employment, and I'll probably talk a little bit more about services in-home. Both Trillium and TLC and many of the other providers in the area do offer both services. Some focus one more on the others, but that's just kind of how we envisioned our time here going for today.
Okay, so oftentimes the starting point for what you're trying to figure out for your child or for your family is what's most important. What's most important for my child, what's most important for my family. And sometimes or often that is a different thing because every person that we potentially would support is a different person and they will need different things. So the biggest starting point is what's important to my child and family. So does that mean where, like, what is it important to figure out where my child will live, or will my child live in my family home still? Is it important to figure out where will my child work, or maybe work is not necessarily important to them at the moment, but those are the things you'll want to talk about and you'll want to figure out. One of the biggest things is we know that people will not have a crystal ball. None of us have a crystal ball. If I went back to the time that I was graduating high school, my life up till now is not what I thought would happen. Is it wonderful and am I glad at where I'm at? Yes, absolutely. This is what I wanted to do, and I am very, very satisfied and happy with what I wanted to do. But if you asked 18-year-old Josh, like, what are you going to do the next 20 years? There's no way that I would be able to have envisioned the great things that I got to be able to do. But what we're going to want to do is kind of figure out what's important right now for my family and my child, because they're going to be leaving this thing that's really been a huge part of their life. High school, school in general has been a part of their life for the last 13 years. And that is something that they've been able to rely on. They've been able to count on every year that this is what's going to happen between September and June every year. And I know that I'm going to be going to school, I'm going to be learning from teachers, I'm going to be progressing, and suddenly that time is coming to an end. So oftentimes it's good to establish what's important to us right now, meaning my child is going to be exiting into adult world, and then also what do I envision for them kind of going off into the future, meaning you know, my child may be living at home still, but we want him or her to look into getting that first job. But in the future, we want them to be able to live in their own place, you know, away from us as the family, you know, in their own apartment or on their own home, that sort of thing. Or maybe we envision them living in a group home or something like that at some point. Or, and for some people, when they're exiting school, that has taken up a big portion of their time and their day. And the family may need someone to be with the person, you know, that supervision, that kind of care sometimes is the most important thing that the person needs. And so sometimes employment may not be the huge priority. It's, you know, what can my son or daughter do in these first bits of time after school so that I know that their day is filled with productive things, they're happy, they're learning things. And sometimes for some people that we support, that's the most important thing, that I know my son or daughter has something important to go to, that's productive, that's helping them continue to learn and progress as a human being, and learn new skills and learn how to, you know, the things that they want to. But, you know, that most important thing may be that they're safe and happy during the day, because now school is over. For some people, that's not as important because, you know, they're safe and happy at home, but they want that job, and that job is what's important. So really, that starting point, again, we don't expect anybody to have a crystal ball, but what's important for your child and your family, and what do you kind of need to have in place when they graduate? Because, you know, that's a looming deadline of, we kind of want people to have that figured out. And you know, all families really want to have that figured out, so they're not stressed about that decision, and what will happen when their son or daughter is done with school. So, all right. Whoop, sorry, I'm running the PowerPoint too. I'm not doing the best job at it, so.
So I think this is one of the questions we see really, really often. And I would guess this is probably an area we have some overlap with any presentations that have been done by the county, but just when to start this process of getting involved with providers, whether it's transition age stuff like employment or just enrolling in services in general. I'm going to speak a little bit more about the in-home part. Josh can jump back in after for more of the employment stuff. For in-home services, I think I have seen in working with people a little bit of a sense that they feel like services for a kiddo in the home need to wait until they're older, maybe closer to that transition age, but that really isn't necessarily the case. So I always, in that case, would encourage people to at least start having the conversation about it as early as there's a perceived need. We'll talk a little bit later about what would have to happen for somebody to qualify for services as a child in the home. But the general sense I've had in talking with county workers and with families is, you know, we had something like these services, we were eligible for them for years, we just didn't really think we were there yet, sort of a thing. So again, whether or not services are pursued as soon as a child qualifies for them, I think at least having those conversations early is important. Sometimes getting services set up, especially for younger age students, takes a little bit more time, especially if there's really specific things to coordinate with an IEP in the school, or around school or special programming schedules. So earlier is better, I think, in that case. It certainly may be a situation where people don't qualify for services until they're getting to that transition age, or their needs are met by a different type of a service until then. But again, I would encourage as soon as the qualification is there to at least have those conversations.
And I would echo off of what Charles just said. You know, I think in all services, as soon as you can start talking about these things, the better off you are. It's really one of those things that kind of getting those things prepared before they're upon you is a really good idea. For the more of the employment stuff, you're going to want to have and get your child connected with voc rehab as soon as you possibly can. And oftentimes that's, you know, they're able to work with kids, you know, kind of starting at the age of 14. And we don't often see that they're doing that as close to that 14-year-old age bracket as others, but we are definitely seeing it by their junior year of high school. And we would highly encourage that that's happening. So getting connected with the counselor that comes to the school that your child goes to is really, really important. What happens kind of, and why it's so important, is there's a bureaucracy and there's a process in all kind of funding streams, meaning either voc rehab or the county, and you're going to want to try to navigate those as soon as you possibly can to kind of get that out of the way. They're wonderful people, the counselors are, to work with, but there's paperwork to handle, there's things to get through. And so if you can get through those things as the kiddos are younger, the better off you are. What it also enables is that as an agency, we could start working with your child while they're still in school, which is a really, really good thing, because we can help to kind of bridge that gap out into adult life. And we can also work on, especially for employment, we can start working on employment related goals and activities, you know, as they're a sophomore, junior, senior in high school, which is really, really beneficial, so that by the time they're ready to graduate, we're probably geared up towards that job, or, you know, at least knowing the direction everybody wants to head. And we've spent a couple of years as a team together working with your child and also with you, and that also is a huge benefit. The longer we know people, the better relationships that we have, the more we can just help people really accomplish the goals that they particularly have. And that's what we all want to do as providers, is help people accomplish the goals and the dreams that they have. So, but yeah, I think, to echo another thing Charles said, is, you know, we didn't think we needed it until now. Well, the sooner you can do it, the better. So, all
right. Another question we see fairly often, and again, this is an area we may be overlapping with the county a little bit on, is determining what service that a person actually needs. If you were to just go on the DHS website and look at the list of what services are available for a person with disabilities, it's overwhelming. It's written in statute language that doesn't necessarily actually tell you what the service is for and what it's going to do. So these are conversations that you can have, of course, with your case manager, with the VRS counselor, depending on what option you're looking at. One thing that I talk to people a lot, especially if I'm at places like job fairs or events like that, is that all of this starts with a referral somewhere. So whether that's, like Josh said, getting connected with the VRS services early on, or if we're looking at services for in-home, that's from a Min Choices assessment, that's from an initial referral to the county. And again, this is an area where starting early is better, because sometimes, like Josh said, there's bureaucracy that goes with funding streams, and sometimes they take time. But that that initial assessment, on whichever side it will be, helps guide what services a person is eligible for, which narrows down the options then quite a bit into deciding what service that you want to have. So just for a couple examples on the in-home services side, a person might have their Min Choices assessment, and it might say, based on the need of this 16-year-old we're meeting with, that they could qualify for respite, which would just mean services to give mom and dad a break. They could qualify for PCA based on the need for some like physical help, or they could qualify for IHS, which is a service designed to help them build skills. And then at that point, then, you know, we've got these three options to look at instead of this big menu of things that you would see on the website. And then you can have those conversations about, what do we really need? Do we need just a break? Do we need some skill building, or whatever piece it would be in there? And then Josh, if you want to talk about maybe like determining pre-ETs or PBAs or differences with VRS, you can dovetail on that.
Yep, and I think that's where your counselor from voc rehab would come in. And that's where the getting connected to them as early as possible, because there are different things and different services that voc rehab can purchase from any provider. The biggest acronym that they're using now is called PREEPS. It's Pre-Employment Transition Services, and you'll hear that acronym get thrown around a lot. It's the funding stream that is there for helping your child kind of while they're in school and while they're transitioning out, to figure out what they want to do for their career. It's a wonderful funding, but it's sometimes, because we use so many acronyms and because we use them so freely, that sometimes it doesn't always make sense. But the ultimate thing is it's determining what the person needs to kind of figure out what they want to do for their working life. Again, it doesn't mean that we're going to figure it out forever or that we're going to have a crystal ball of what the child will do 20 years from now, but it's kind of figuring out, what do I want to do for that first or second job of my life? What are the things that I need to kind of figure out so that I'm taking a job that I want to do? And it doesn't mean that it's going to maybe be a perfect job, because we all have things that we don't like about each position that we do, but it does mean that we're gearing up towards something that really is about the person, and it's about their skills and wants. You know, it's about kind of figuring out if the person wants to work, say, in retail or in childcare, or, you know, I want to work at a nursing home versus out at a restaurant. Or do I want to head off to, you know, a training program or college or those sorts of things? So pre-employment transition services really can enable a provider to help the student figure out what they want to do, kind of for that next step after school. So some things that we can do are things like informational interviews and job shadows and helping to develop resumes and working on job seeking skills, working on self-advocacy, working on work experiences. A lot of the schools around us have very robust work experience programs, but some schools don't. And so sometimes that's where we can help out, doing work experience and helping to, you know, establish internships and things like that. The flip side, or the things that aren't pre-ets, would be like, we can help people find a job. And sometimes that's where people are at. I know kind of what I want to do. I want to just proceed out of school and get that job, you know, as I'm exiting school, and so that I can work for a while and so that I can kind of start my career. And so a lot of times we're doing that with people too. It really is dependent on where the person's at. If we start early, if we're able to work with kids in school, we can kind of help pave the way to greater success by doing things that will benefit them, no matter who they are and no matter how much they have it figured out. If I could rewind and go back to high school and have someone help me with a resume and take me on 5 job shadows and go and talk to a bunch of employers, I would have loved to do that, because not all of us have it figured out of what we want to do. And not all of us have really seen our community for all that it can offer. And so sometimes that's really what a provider is trying to do, is kind of open up the community to show people what it has to offer, so that it can help a person kind of navigate to those things that they are most inclined to. And so how do we determine what service we need? That's where you want to connect to the counselor at Voc Rehab or the county case manager as soon as possible, because they're the ones that can help navigate those funding streams. And they can also be the one who can help navigate to a provider and help to coordinate those things so that what's wanted happens. So.
We've already circled around the idea of funding for services a little bit here. So I want to just take a minute to talk about what those funding services look like. So when we are looking at working with a provider and having funding for the types of services we offer, I have to generalize some, but I do know that most, if not all, of the providers in the area for the types of services that we're looking at, very, very few of them take private pay. There might be some that do, but generally speaking, most providers don't. But most of the time it's not needed, because there are these different funding streams available. For a lot of specifics on what those consist of, again, this is where we'd want to be talking to the county case managers or the VR folks. But generally speaking, there's either a direct MA funding source or a county-based waiver funding source that covers all in-home and residential services. And I guess I've been using those two terms without really clarifying what I mean. So when I say residential services, we're talking about a group home or a place somebody goes to live, whereas when we're talking about in-home services, we mean that staff are provided in a person's home or in their family home out in the community, whether it's an apartment or a house or whatever it might be. By and large, nearly all of the services that are offered in this area, whether it's PCA, whether it's respite, whether it's some of those skill building services, or in some cases, employment services, are funded through those sources, through the county waivers or through a direct MA source. So again, there's starting points to things. For these ones, the starting point is usually that the person needs to have at least applied for, if not qualified for, medical assistance. That's the starting point to get those set. And then again, that referral to the county office to talk from there. But just generally speaking, there's the three waivers, the DD waiver, the CADI waiver, and the brain injury waiver that are most commonly served. There are other ones also, but those are the three that are used the most when we're talking about providers similar to what we're looking at here. Those cover the in-home services. They cover a different form of employment services than is funded by the Voc Rehab Center. And then there's also in our region, there's grants available too. They don't always cover as big of a scope of services, but that can have a person get a few hours of support here and there, depending on what they're looking like. The nice part about that is for most families, that means that there isn't money coming out of their pocket to pay for services. There are, with everything, there's rules for MA regarding, how many assets a person can have and things like that. That might be something that has to get factored in. But generally speaking, there's funding for the services that's not coming from mom and dad or the individual, but there is paperwork, of course, that's required to keep up on it. So one of the biggest conversations I have is, when you see something in the mail from the county saying, hey, you got to fill this out and get it back, or we need this filled out within 6 months or whatever it might be. It's obviously really important, but I hate to stress it to the point that I've had situations where the paperwork hasn't gotten done, the funding stream dried up, and then all of a sudden that person who has been relying on support literally has no support available because the paperwork didn't get done. So that's one of the bigger points I tend to emphasize when we're talking about funding, not so much what the money source looks like, but just what people do to keep it coming, more or less. That's the paperwork piece.
So just to speak to how Voc Rehab funding works, just so because there is a little bit of a distinction, that is not MA funded, that is a state and federal match. And so every state has a VR system, and they are the strength of that system is determined by how much the state puts into that funding. And so the state of Minnesota has a very robust VR system, meaning they're getting up to their max that they can actually put into their program, and so then they're getting their max of the federal funding. So where it's different is it's not MA funded, meaning it is supposed to be the first dollar in that is supposed to support employment services. So if your child wants to work, that they need to navigate through the VR system. Because that is the first system that we should be paying a provider to help your child to figure out employment, get employment, that sort of thing. If your child then also needs long-term services, meaning they got a job, they got trained in, but they need a job coach or a staff person to be with them to support them at their job long-term, that moves into the waiver funding. And so there is a bit of an intermingling and a bit of a kind of where everybody has to work together on those things. And so that's where kind of getting them both in place, if your child needs it, is really important. So if you're envisioning that your child does need that long-term services in employment, navigating through the DHS system with the waiver is important to get a county case manager, and it's also important to get a VR counselor. It does mean that there's lots of people on the team, and that sometimes can be overwhelming and confusing, but the way you should also look at it is you're getting the people on the team that really do know each business and the things that they're supposed to bring to the team. And so you're getting really valuable people on the team for your child. And that's important to do, and getting them on board and part of your child's team as quickly and as soon as you can is a big thing.
So how to get started? once we've gotten to the point of working with the county or with VR office and knowing that you're going to use services from a provider, what does that process look like? So I'm going to talk about the waiver services. Josh can jump in with the VR process after. It starts with the county case manager. You know, we've had that min choices assessment. We've determined that you're eligible for services, and you've picked what services you're looking for. And this is where it really gets to be a team event, because it's not just here's a list of phone numbers, call all these providers and ask who's giving services. I guess you probably could do it that way if you wanted to, but this really is a coordinated, collaborative effort between all levels of a support team. So what will usually happen is if it's determined that your child is eligible for in-home services to build some skills around cleaning their room and cooking with some accommodations for developmental level. The county case manager that you're working with will give you an informed choice about what providers in the area can meet that need. That can look like a lot of different things. I have had situations where it's just some phone calls where the family and the case manager call together and just chat on the phone or do a video chat with the providers just to talk about them and talk about their process, how soon they can have staffing ready, those types of things. I've had really formal informed choice events where the family and the case manager are sitting down for like 3 hours and there's 5 providers coming that each have a half hour to kind of do a pitch for what they have available. I do know families that have said, you know what, we just trust you as the county case manager to tell us what like the top 2 best choices are for what we're looking for. So you have a lot of say and a lot of control in the process of what provider you're working with. Again, what that process, that informed choice and how you pick one might look different based on your preferences, based on how your case manager works. But it's not just that. The 2 fears I think I hear are either one, I just have a list of phone numbers and I got to call them, or that I don't have a choice. I just have to go with whoever's available. And that's very much not the case. Now, of course, it could be that some providers don't have staffing available as quickly, or some providers don't offer the specific service you're looking for, but would offer some different ones that are similar. And those sometimes get into larger conversations about if you find you have a provider you want to work with, or you have a service you really need to pursue, depending on what it is that way. So sometimes they get bigger picture in those senses. But what I like about this process is that it gives families the chance to make sure they're really finding a provider they want to work with. But then at the same time, it gives the provider the chance to make sure that we're going to do our job well. You know, when we have these meet and greets, I know even if I'm not going to end up working with that family, that if they decide to work with us, that these are the services people are looking for. This is how many staffing hours I would have to have ready to go. You know, this is the type of coordination. We're working with the Hermantown School District, maybe on an IEP plan, that they are working with VR at the same time because they want to work someday. And it gives us the chance to really get our feet under us to make sure that if that family says, yes, we want to go with you, that we're ready and can meet their needs.
And I would echo what Charles is saying. I think the biggest thing, and what I tell families all the time, is we're in the relationship business. Meaning it's our jobs to develop a relationship with you guys. It's our job to develop a relationship with your child. It's our job to develop relationships with anybody else who's in the team, to be able to coordinate and to be able to make sure that the services are the very best they possibly can be. And that's getting to know people, that's figuring out what they want, that's hearing what people have to say, that's listening, that's really getting into the nitty gritty of how do we support people the best we possibly can, and hear what they're telling us about what they want to see and what their goals are. The differences for like waivered services versus VR, this kind of how do we start services are very similar in that both systems have informed choice. The only difference would be it's not your county case manager setting these meetings up with you, it's your VR counselor. And oftentimes, if you have a county case manager as well, they'll come to those meetings or be a part of those meetings. And so it really does feel like a collaborative effort to get to pick the provider that best suits you. I think that the biggest thing is, because there's a lot of good providers out there, it's figuring out which services do I want from who. And sometimes that can be very different. Sometimes you could want your residential services to be from one provider, but your employment services be from another provider. Or maybe you feel like it's really, really important that my son or daughter is supported by one provider for all of their services. And so it really then hones in on which providers can do that and which providers are best at doing that. We all have our abilities and our kind of things that we're the best at, the best at, and you really want to hone in on what does my son or daughter need and who can provide that the best for them, along with who has staff, all of those other intangibles. So, all right.
So we really like to emphasize when we're working with families or individuals who are getting services or interacting with providers for the first time, that this is really a bigger team effort. So we have to speak a little bit generally because different companies are structured in different ways. But with almost every provider for waivered services or for services through VR, there's layers of individuals involved with your care. So with if it's a situation where you're receiving the services for again, your 16-year-old in your home, for the services coming to your home, there will almost always be at least 2 levels of that team. You'll have your direct service professional. That's the person who's actually coming out to your house, spending time with your son or daughter, and are working on their goals. DSP, direct service professional, is a more general term. Different companies call their direct care staff something different in some cases, but that's the person that's actually out at the house working with you or with your family member. But there is almost always a behind the scenes person too. And that's somebody who usually works at the office that supervises the individual that's out at your home. Maybe they're overseeing services in a bigger picture, whatever it might be. But that's usually the person that you can call and say, hey, you know what, I'm just not clicking with my worker. Or I really want to let you know that this is working really well. We like those phone calls better. Or, this, I really liking the service, but this schedule isn't working for me. So that's kind of your behind the scenes person, supervisor person. And in a lot of cases, that is the individual who's actually coming to your team meetings with the county or your VR rep too. In many cases, the behind the scenes person does that work, sometimes in addition to, or sometimes in place of the direct service staff too. Again, depending on what company you're working with, everybody's function is a little bit different. I know just even differences between TLC and Trillium. We have 2 levels. We're a smaller company, so the directors of our services are also the supervisors of our direct care staff, where I believe Trillium has another layer in there based on.
We have 3, and so we have another person who would be supervising the supervisors, and so we have another level there, and so they're the people that are definitely ensuring quality of services with making sure the supervisors are doing what they're supposed to do, and then the supervisors are kind of overseeing the direct staff. So
yeah, it'll be different depending on what provider you're working with, but there should usually be those 2 different cases.
All right, so next slide is about staff, and we often get, I don't know, 1,000 questions about staff. So the common questions that we get are, how do they get selected? Do I get to choose? Can a family member be my staff? What are the training requirements? What are the license requirements? Because I guess the common thread there is, how do I know I'm getting a quality staff?
Yeah.
How do you guys make sure that I get a quality staff for my son or daughter or for myself? And that's like, of course, that's what we want to make sure happens all the time. And so how do they get selected? So from Trillium's standpoint, what we try to do is we try to kind of match people by personality, because what we find is if we're matching people by personality and what they like to do, that often is creating this environment where they're having a good relationship. Obviously, it's a professional relationship, but the people will enjoy being together. And I think that that's always a big important thing. Next question is, how do I get to choose, or do I get to choose? And oftentimes we do that. I know a lot of providers are kind of helping people choose their staff by being parts of interviews, that sort of thing. That's not always possible. And so a lot of times I think us included and other providers are doing the best job they can to listen to people when a new staff is coming into their life. Meaning, how did that first day go? Did you like them? What do you think about them? That sort of thing. And being really, ears wide open about the things that aren't going right and the things that maybe not the best. So that we can either make a change or maybe we can help the situation kind of grow. Can a family member be my staff? That is a varying answer depending on which provider you are. And some are absolutely no, and some are absolutely yes, and some are it's a maybe. And so really you're going to want to ask that question of any provider that you would choose to work with if that's something that you want to see. Because there's arguments on both sides. There's arguments that, it's good to have a family member be it because they obviously know the person the best. They can help with the quality of care. It's a continuation of like that CDCS model. And those things are all valid and important. The other thing that is the flip side is sometimes having an outside person who's not family helps a person learn differently, grow differently, that sort of thing. Like any mom or dad will know that if I tell my child to do something, they're going to do the exact opposite. But if their teacher or somebody else that they respect tell them the same thing, they'll do it. And for whatever reason, there's magic in that sometimes. And that's one thing we want to kind of keep in mind. It doesn't mean that a family member wouldn't do a good job, but sometimes there's just that dynamic going on. Training requirements and licensing requirements are kind of the same, thing in the fact that it's the licensing requirements that kind of inform the training requirements. So in order for us to have any staff that starts, the state of Minnesota requires us to have them have 30 hours of training in their first 60 days of employment, which is a lot, which is a good thing. I'm not saying that's a lot and it's a bad thing. It's a really good thing. We also have to have a person have 12 hours of training before they'll ever be out providing services alone with a person, which is also a good thing. And so those are requirements that are set forward by state licensing, and we have to obtain those. And so whether you're at Trillium or TLC or fill in the blank, you have to have those requirements done. Otherwise, you're violating your license and you're not doing what you're supposed to. Beyond that, there's lots of providers, and TLC and Trillium are included in this, in that we continually train our staff all the time, because we really want our staff to have a lot of abilities, and there's a lot to tell people and there's a lot to teach people how to do, because there's thousands and thousands of bits of information about everyone we support. And it really is about honing in on helping our staff figure those things out, really getting to the point where they can kind of operate and do the right thing without having to be told to do the right thing. And that sometimes takes a lot of training and a lot of time, because there's so many situations that they are confronted with on a daily basis that we want to keep talking about those things and teaching on those things and role modeling those situations as we go. So the biggest thing is, all providers want your son or daughter to have quality staff. And the biggest thing is, if you feel like that's not the case, talk to somebody. Tell the supervisor, make a call, make those things happen. We also want to make sure that we can keep quality staff around. So if you have a good staff that you like, let us know that too. Like Charles was saying, we like to hear the good things. Oftentimes we only hear the bad things, so it's nice to hear the good things sometimes. But no, it's really about if it's a good match, if it's really impacting your son or daughter's life in a great way, we want to know that too. Because our main goal is good quality staff that do a really good job, because that's really what our services are about. It's not the other things. It's not the the things that we do here at the office. It's really about the impact that our staff make on your son or daughter and the goals that they have in life. So,
and I always like to emphasize, like Josh said, it's really about finding that person that's a good fit. If it's somebody you have a decent relationship with, you're more likely to want to spend time with them and work on your goals or things like that. But I also get a lot of questions too about just what's realistic. Because there's pragmatic pieces that go into finding staff too. So in some cases, it's just starting out, maybe if we're talking about in-home services, it's just starting out, when are you available to have your staff? Do I have to find somebody who's available in the afternoons? Does it need to be weekends? Do we have things like that to work around? We always, in kind of our process, look for kind of building the perfect staff person. Doesn't matter their gender. Do you want somebody who's really quiet? Do you want somebody who's outgoing? What are the similar interests, like Josh was saying? And we want to find that right match. But it also is realistic to know if we get too specific, it's going to take us longer to find staff. If you tell me I need somebody who's in their 50s, has blonde hair, wears glasses, and has a Southern accent, I will find you that person, but it's going to take a lot longer. So there's some logistics that have to go into that piece of it. I also have general conversations about if you prefer to have all of your services with one person, or if you like having more than one staff. There's benefits to both. This is the one person I'm going to really get to know. The downside is if that person leaves, then we totally start over. Whereas if you have more than one, you've got some natural backup built in, or maybe, different people have different strengths that you work on one thing with your first person and something else with your second person. But again, that can be limited by logistics too. If it's a situation where we're spending a couple hours in the house every single day of the week, realistically finding a staff member who's willing to work 7 days a week is challenging. So in that case, you certainly wouldn't have to only have one worker, but it probably would take longer to find one worker who's able to do all those. So we kind of have to parse through some of these, pragmatic pieces, I guess you could call it too, so we can really find that quote unquote perfect person that's a good match in terms of personality, but that we can actually realistically deliver on what we're promising that we're going to do. So sometimes that piece of it can be one of the bigger planning pieces too, going into things.
That's a really good point, because sometimes the logistics of hiring is daunting in itself. And getting those people, we want to do our best, but sometimes that we're doing our best, and sometimes that's we're going to keep trying because it may be not quite what you're wanting. So,
and it's probably worth mentioning too. Another question I have is about like longevity of staff life, and this is a thing I think providers across the board would say, because it is part of working in this field, not about us as providers, but working in human services tends to be a higher turnover field than other ones. We're working with people, and working with people affects us as people in different ways, but also in many cases, we see people who are really starting to get into a career that will ultimately have them go to be a social worker or a nurse or something like that someday, which can contribute to that too. So again, in the sense of being really realistic, I want to find that worker that's going to work with your family for the entire time you need services, but that's not something we can ever promise either. We can't predict that part of our employees' lives.
all right. So our final slide was questions.
And I guess in the absence of anybody here to ask questions,
Yeah.
You can certainly, the last slide we have up has mine and Josh's contact information both on it. Or if you had any questions, you could certainly, I'm sure, forward them through Jess. If there's anything that we can answer for you more specific about our companies that we offer, or just something that we didn't hit more as clearly as you would like in over.
No, we're more than happy to always answer questions. I think when Charles and I were developing kind of the talking points for today, he and I both spend lots of our days taking calls, kind of helping families get directed to where they need to go and all those sorts of things. So it's pretty common that we help families do that. So and we like that part of our job the most. And so definitely don't feel bad about asking questions or reaching out.
Thank you both. I really appreciate the information you shared. It just gives a good picture from when we've done this whole webinar, kind of that web of services that start once a student leaves high school or is being built at the same time as the high schools continuing to provide those services. And, you know, starting your presentation with the first thing about finding out what is important to that individual or that family is so critical. And I think, you know, we're starting to have those conversations more within IEP meetings too. So then it kind of does some of that front loading as they transition to agencies such as yourself. So